The global financial system rests on a single, fragile foundation, trust. And today, that trust is being tested in a way many experts once believed was impossible. Quietly behind closed doors, major Chinese banks are pulling back from US dollar based assets. At the same time, Washington is moving forward with a decision that may permanently change the rules of global finance. This is not speculation. This is not a rumor. It is already happening. And the consequences could ripple through every country, every banking system, and every currency connected to the dollar. For decades, the US dollar has occupied a unique position in the world. It was considered untouchable, neutral, above politics. Nations stored their wealth in dollars because they believed one fundamental promise: no matter who you are, your reserves are safe. That belief is now beginning to fracture. When the United States froze and later moved to repurpose Russian foreign reserves, it sent a message far beyond Moscow. Frozen assets were no longer just frozen. They became a political tool. To many governments watching closely, this crossed a line that cannot be erased. Once money can be seized and redirected, it is no longer neutral. And once neutrality is gone, trust disappears with it. China noticed, and China understood the warning clearly. In response, Chinese state-linked banks have begun quietly reducing their exposure to US dollar assets. Treasury holdings are being trimmed, dollar reserves are being adjusted. Long-term financial ties that once symbolized global stability are being re-examined. These moves are not announced on television. They are not explained in press releases. They are careful, strategic, and deliberate. And that silence is exactly why they matter. This is not a sudden collapse. It is a slow repositioning, a recalibration. History shows that major financial shifts rarely happen overnight. They unfold quietly through policy changes, balance sheet adjustments, and strategic diversification. Markets feel the effects later, often when it is already too late to react. What we are witnessing is something once considered unthinkable: the world's second largest economy acting on a fear many nations share but rarely admit. If one country's reserves can be seized and repurposed, then no country's reserves are truly safe. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. That realization is forcing governments, central banks, and financial institutions to rethink everything they believed about security, sovereignty, and control. It raises uncomfortable questions about the future of reserve currencies and the risks of political alignment in a globalized financial system. This is not about abandoning the dollar overnight. It is about hedging against vulnerability, about reducing exposure to a system where financial assets can be weaponized. And as more countries quietly draw the same conclusions, the structure of global finance begins to shift, slowly, silently, but profoundly. In this video, we will explore why China sees the seizure of Russian reserves not as a distant geopolitical event, but as a direct warning. We will examine what it really means when major banks begin stepping away from dollar assets. And most importantly, we will explain why this process doesn't trigger instant chaos, but instead reshapes markets over time, in ways that few people notice until the consequences are unavoidable. The question is no longer whether trust in the system is changing. The question is how far that change will go and who will be ready when it does. You will see how the weaponization of money is reshaping global power and why this moment could mark the beginning of a slow, but historic, shift away from dollar dominance. We will also break down the lesser-known mechanics behind reserve assets, explain why confidence matters more than force in global finance, and show how even small cracks in trust can trigger massive consequences over time. This is not just about geopolitics. It is about savings, stability, and the invisible rules that govern the world economy. Stay with us until the end, because the final takeaway explains why this decision may ultimately cost the United States more power than it gains, and why other nations are now quietly preparing for a future where money is no longer neutral. Welcome to our channel, where we break down the forces shaping the global economy without noise or distraction. If you value clear analysis, deep context, and stories that go beyond the headlines, subscribe and stay with us. Over the past year, the United States and its allies froze hundreds of billions of dollars belonging to Russia's central bank. These were not private funds. They were national reserves, cash, bonds, and foreign currency assets, stored inside Western financial systems to support trade, stabilize the economy, and protect against crisis. Until recently, these reserves were only frozen. Russia could not access them, but they were still leg. ally recognized as Russian property. That distinction mattered. It preserved the long-standing assumption that central bank reserves, even during conflict, were fundamentally protected. That line has now shifted. Washington has approved a legal framework allowing income generated from these frozen assets to be redirected. And in some cases, it lays the groundwork for the assets themselves to be used to support Ukraine. This means interest earned on Russian reserves held abroad can be collected and transferred without Russia's consent. In practical terms, money that once sat idle as a neutral store of value is now being actively repurposed for political and strategic objectives. This is a fundamental change. It transforms reserves from passive financial insurance into tools of state power. To understand why this matters, it is important to clarify what central bank reserves actually are. These reserves exist to protect a nation during emergencies. They stabilize currencies, reassure investors, and allow governments to continue importing food, energy, and critical supplies during periods of stress. They are designed to be untouchable precisely because trust in their safety underpins the entire global financial system. When that trust weakens, the consequences extend far beyond a single country. Other governments are watching closely. They are not reacting with speeches or dramatic announcements. Instead, they are making quiet adjustments, diversifying reserves, rethinking exposure, and reassessing where they store national wealth. These are slow moves, but they are deliberate. History shows that financial power does not collapse suddenly. It erodes gradually, through confidence lost rather than force applied. Reserve currencies do not fall because they are attacked. They fall because alternatives begin to feel safer. The decision to repurpose frozen reserves may deliver short-term leverage, but it also introduces a long-term cost. The perception that money held within the system is conditional. That perception alone changes behavior. And once behavior changes, the system itself begins to shift. What we are witnessing may not be the end of dollar dominance, but it could be the moment when the idea of neutral money truly ends. And in a world where money is no longer neutral, every nation must rethink how it protects its future. They stabilize currencies, support international trade, and reassure markets that a nation can meet its obligations even during crisis. Central bank reserves are typically held in foreign banks and government bonds because they are assumed to be safe, liquid, and protected by long-standing international norms. When those norms hold, reserves function as insurance. When they break, reserves become exposed. This decision goes far beyond punishing Russia. It reshapes expectations for every country that holds assets inside another nation's financial system. The message is no longer only about sanctions. It is about control. If sovereign reserves can be frozen, managed, and ultimately redirected based on political alignment, then financial safety is no longer guaranteed by law alone. It becomes conditional. Many governments recognize that Russia is a special case, but they also understand the power of precedent. Global finance runs not just on written rules, but on shared assumptions. Once a major reserve currency issuer demonstrates that sovereign assets can be used as leverage, every other nation must reassess its own exposure. This applies not only to rivals, but to partners and even long-standing allies. Another overlooked factor is timing. This shift comes at a moment when global debt levels are high, trust between major powers is low, and alternatives to the dollar-centered system are slowly expanding. In such an environment, even modest policy changes can produce outsized effects. Markets may not react immediately, but central banks do not think in days or weeks. They think in decades. The United States still holds enormous influence over the global financial system, but influence is not permanent. It depends on confidence. By moving from freezing reserves to actively using them, Washington has introduced a new variable into global finance, one that forces other nations to quietly reconsider how, where, and in what form they store their national wealth. No country is more sensitive to this shift than China. Over the past several decades, China has built one of the largest foreign reserve stockpiles in the world. A significant portion of those reserves remains tied to US dollar assets, including American government bonds, dollar-denominated deposits, and financial instruments linked directly to the US system. This exposure was not accidental. For years, the dollar offered unmatched liquidity, stability, and global acceptance. It allowed China to manage massive trade flows, stabilize its currency, and protect itself against external economic shocks. Holding dollar assets was not a polity. Cal choice, it was a practical one. But the treatment of Russian reserves fundamentally changed how that exposure is perceived. What once looked like a neutral foundation for global finance now carries political risk. And when political risk enters reserve management, diversification becomes not just an option, but a necessity. China does not need to abandon the dollar to feel its vulnerability. It only needs to recognize that access is no longer unconditional. That realization is now quietly shaping long term strategy. From Beijing's perspective, the issue is not political alignment, it is structural risk. Russia's reserves were held abroad under the same assumptions China has relied on for decades. They were stored inside systems believed to be neutral, rule based, and insulated from political interference. When those reserves were first frozen, and then partially redirected, Chinese policymakers saw a scenario they had previously modeled only in theory become reality. The country that issues the reserve currency also holds ultimate control. China does not see itself as Russia. Its economy is far larger, more diversified, and deeply integrated into global trade networks. But that is precisely what makes the parallel unsettling. Greater integration means greater exposure. When geopolitical tensions rise, financial interdependence can transform from a source of stability into a point of vulnerability. The lesson is simple and uncomfortable. Access to reserves depends not only on ownership but on approval. There is also a deeper concern tied to sovereignty. Foreign reserves are meant to be a nation's final line of defense. They exist for moments of crisis, when markets turn hostile, capital flees, or supply chains fracture. They allow governments to stabilize currencies, secure imports, and maintain basic economic function when conditions deteriorate. If those reserves can be restricted, managed, or repurposed by another government, their role changes entirely. They stop being protection and start becoming leverage held by someone else. This creates a fundamental tension between trust and control. The global financial system depends on the belief that rules apply equally to all participants. Yet real control resides with the countries that issue reserve currencies and host the world's financial infrastructure. For decades, China accepted this imbalance because the benefits, liquidity, stability, and global access outweighed the risks. The Russian case altered that calculation. Control was no longer theoretical. It was exercised openly, and the consequences were visible. What had once been considered an extreme scenario became a precedent. Another critical factor is signaling. Beijing understands that actions taken against one country are never viewed in isolation. They are observed, analyzed, and internalized by others. Financial power does not need to be applied repeatedly to be effective. It only needs to be used once, clearly. That clarity triggered internal reviews across China's financial system, within central planning bodies, regulatory institutions, and major state-owned banks. These reviews are not driven by panic or sudden fear. They are methodical, strategic, focused on reducing exposure gradually rather than provoking disruption. In global finance, adjustments rarely happen loudly. They occur through balance sheets, policy guidance, and long-term allocation decisions. The goal is not to exit the system overnight, but to ensure that no single point of control carries disproportionate risk. Trust, after all, takes decades to build, and only moments to weaken. And once trust begins to erode, even slowly, the architecture of global finance starts to change in ways that are difficult to reverse. China's alarm is rooted in a simple realization. Trust alone may no longer be sufficient to protect national wealth held beyond its own borders. Beijing's response has not come through speeches, press conferences, or official declarations. Instead, it has moved quietly through the banking system, where strategic decisions are made with patience and executed over time. At the center of this response are China's state-owned banks. These institutions do not operate like private banks in the West. They are closely aligned with national policy objectives and often function as instruments of long-term state strategy rather than short-term profit maximization. When state banks adjust their exposure, it typically reflects guidance from the highest levels, even if no public directive is ever issued. The changes unfold across balance sheets, trading desks, and reserve management operations. The objective is not to shock markets or send a political message. It is to reduce risk while remaining invisible. This is why the response appears slow on the surface, yet significant beneath it. The phrase dumping US dollar assets can be misleading. It does not mean selling everything at once. That approach would be costly, disruptive, and counterproductive. Instead, the process is far more controlled. New purchases are reduced. Existing bonds are allowed to mature without replacement. Excess reserves are gradually shifted into other currencies or alternative assets. Over time, this quietly reduces dollar exposure without triggering panic, sudden price swings, or diplomatic backlash. To understand why this matters, it helps to simplify the instruments involved. Bonds and treasuries are, at their core, loans to governments. When China holds US Treasuries, it is lending money to Washington in exchange for interest and the assumption of safety. Foreign reserves, meanwhile, are savings held to defend a currency, stabilize trade, and ensure against crisis. For many years, the dollar fulfilled all of these roles efficiently. The concern today is not yield or performance, it is access. State-owned banks manage enormous portfolios that include government debt, foreign currency deposits, and cross-border investments. Adjustments within these portfolios rarely happen through dramatic moves. They occur through a series of small decisions. A maturing bond is not rolled over. A new reserve allocation favors a different currency. A trade settlement avoids the dollar when an alternative exists. Each individual step appears minor. Taken together, they represent a strategic shift. Another critical element is messaging. Public announcements can trigger market volatility and provoke political responses. Quiet actions avoid headlines. By remaining silent, Chinese banks preserve flexibility. They can slow, pause, or reverse course if conditions improve, or accelerate if risks increase. The silence itself is intentional. It keeps options open while signaling seriousness to those paying close attention. There is also coordination involved. Major state banks tend to move in parallel, even if their actions are not identical. This creates a steady, controlled adjustment rather than a sudden rupture. Smaller banks and financial institutions often follow the lead of these giants, amplifying the effect gradually across the system. What emerges is not a dramatic break, but a slow rebalancing, one designed to reduce vulnerability without drawing attention. And in global finance, it is often these quiet shifts, not the loud ones, that matter most. None of this happens overnight. Reserve diversification unfolds over months and years, not days or weeks. But in global finance, direction matters far more than speed. The response inside China's banking system illustrates how financial power is exercised without confrontation, using balance sheets instead of statements and patience instead of pressure. These adjustments also raise a broader question about coordination. They do not exist in isolation. They fit into a larger, long developing trend known as de-dollarization, the gradual effort by many countries to reduce their dependence on the US dollar for trade, reserves, and financial infrastructure. This trend did not begin with Russia, and it did not begin this year. It has been building quietly as geopolitical tensions increased and financial tools became more openly political. Each sanction, asset freeze, and regulatory action reinforce the idea that access to the dollar system is conditional. For China, de-dollarization is not a sudden reaction. It is a long-term strategy that has been unfolding for years. Beijing has worked methodically to expand the use of its own currency in trade settlements, particularly with energy exporters and regional partners. Bilateral currency swap lines have been established with other central banks, allowing trade to continue without passing through the dollar system. Parallel to this, alternative payment infrastructure has been developed to reduce reliance on Western controlled financial networks. These systems were not designed to replace the global order overnight. They were built as contingencies, insurance against future risk. Past actions reveal a clear pattern. China gradually reduced the share of US Treasuries in its reserves over time, even during periods of relatively stable relations with Washington. It increased its gold holdings, favoring an asset that is politically neutral and not issued by any government. It encouraged commodity contracts priced in local currencies and promoted regional trade agreements that minimized dollar use. None of these steps caused disruption on their own. Each appeared technical, incremental, and easy to overlook. But together, they laid the groundwork for a system that is more resilient to external control. What makes the current moment different is both speed and motivation. The freezing and redirection of Russian reserves compressed timelines dramatically. Risks that once seemed distant or theoretical became immediate and concrete. Strategic plans that might have unfolded gradually over decades are now being reviewed with urgency. When financial norms shift, preparation turns into action. At the world may not be witnessing the collapse of the dollar's role, but it may be witnessing the acceleration of a transition that was already underway. And in global finance, the most important changes are rarely announced. They are reflected quietly in portfolios, settlement systems, and long-term planning. By the time the consequences become visible, the direction has already been set. Another force accelerating this shift is alignment with other countries. China is not alone in reassessing exposure to the US dollar. A growing number of economies, large and small, are exploring similar paths even if their motivations differ. This creates reinforcement. When multiple players move in the same direction, the cost of change falls and the confidence to act increases. Coordination in global finance does not require formal alliances or joint announcements. Shared incentives are enough. When the same risks are recognized across borders, similar responses emerge naturally. This is how financial systems evolve without visible leadership or centralized control. Technology is also reshaping the landscape. Digital settlement platforms, alternative clearing channels, and local currency trade mechanisms are far more advanced than they were a decade ago. These tools reduce friction and make diversification practical rather than theoretical. What once depended on trust alone, now depends on access and infrastructure. The result is a shift that appears gradual on the surface, but carries real momentum beneath it. Each policy decision, each reserve adjustment, and each trade settlement choice feeds into a broader transformation. This moment accelerates that process because it confirms a concern many governments had quietly held for years. Once a fear is confirmed, hesitation disappears. From Washington's perspective, the decision to use Russian assets was not taken lightly. It emerged from a mix of strategic calculation, political urgency, and confidence in existing financial dominance. Frozen reserves were seen as a rare form of leverage, one that could impose real costs without deploying troops or escalating direct military confrontation. Within this logic, money became a tool of statecraft. It offered a way to apply pressure while supporting an ally under sustained attack. There was also a practical consideration. Supporting Ukraine required long-term funding, and domestic political support for repeated aid packages was beginning to strain. Redirecting income generated from Russian reserves provided a way to sustain assistance without asking voters for higher taxes or additional borrowing. The move was framed as accountability rather than punishment, reinforcing the narrative that Russia would bear the financial consequences of its own actions. Political pressure played a central role. Lawmakers faced demands to act decisively and visibly. Over time, freezing assets alone began to feel symbolic. Using them signaled resolve to allies abroad and to audiences at home. In moments of conflict, inaction can easily be interpreted as weakness, especially when tools are available. This created momentum toward a bolder step, even as the long-term consequences remained uncertain. Financial systems, however, operate on a different timeline than politics. Markets and central banks respond slowly, adjusting portfolios over years rather than reacting to headlines. This gap allows short-term gains to feel manageable while deeper risks remain abstract. The immediate benefits were clear. The longer-term cost, the gradual erosion of trust, was harder to measure, easier to discount, and slower to surface. But in global finance, trust does not vanish all at once. It fades quietly, one decision at a time. Another factor behind this decision was confidence in the dollar's position. For decades, the United States has benefited from its currency's central role in global trade and finance. That dominance created a sense of insulation. Policymakers believed alternatives were limited, and that other countries had few viable options at scale. This perception reduced the perceived risk of action. If the dollar is unavoidable, then leverage can be applied without fear of exit. Power projection also played a role. Demonstrating the ability to control assets across borders reinforces influence. It sends a clear signal that global financial infrastructure is not neutral, but governed. This message was aimed not only at Russia, but at any actor considering a challenge to the existing order. It emphasized that access to the system comes with conditions. Yet power projection carries trade-offs. The same action that deters one actor can unsettle many others. Using financial assets as a weapon clarifies who holds authority, but it also clarifies dependence. That clarity forces observers to reassess their own exposure, even if they never intended to confront Washington directly. In global finance, fear does not require hostility. It only requires awareness. Viewed through this lens, the decision follows a familiar pattern. Immediate strategic advantage outweighed distant structural risk. The benefits were visible, measurable, and politically valuable. The costs were diffuse, delayed, and global. Short-term leverage was easy to justify. Long-term consequences were harder to quantify and easier to dismiss. Outside the public spotlight, governments and financial institutions around the world have been studying the U.S. decision with careful attention. Official statements remain restrained, diplomatic, and cautious, but private discussions tell a different story. For many countries, this was not seen as an isolated sanction tied only to Russia. It was interpreted as a signal about how power now operates inside the global financial system. The rules had not been rewritten on paper, but they had been redefined in practice. The first response was analytical rather than emotional. Finance ministries and central banks began asking internal questions about exposure, legal protection, and access. Where are reserves held? Under which jurisdictions? In what form? And how quickly could those assets become restricted if political relationships deteriorate? These reviews are not about defiance, they are about resilience. Countries want to understand how vulnerable they are to decisions made outside their borders. They want to know whether assets assumed to be safe would remain accessible in moments of crisis. The goal is not to confront the system, but to reduce reliance on any single point of control. In global finance, change rarely begins with protest, it begins with preparation. And once preparation starts, behavior slowly shifts, quietly, methodically, and often long before the consequences become visible to the public. There has been a noticeable increase in quiet reassessments of US dollar reserves around the world. This does not mean sudden selling or dramatic exits. It means something more subtle and more important. Long-standing assumptions are being stress-tested. Assumptions that guided reserve management for decades are now being re-examined under new conditions. Liquidity and safety still matter, but so does control, and the balance between those priorities is being recalculated. Banks play a central role in this process. Large international banks manage reserve assets, facilitate global settlements, and provide access to international markets. Inside these institutions, risk teams are reviewing scenarios that once seemed extreme or implausible. Questions about asset freezes, legal jurisdiction, and cross-border enforcement are no longer theoretical. These discussions rarely leave boardrooms, but they shape strategy for years to come. Central banks are just as attentive. Their operations depend on trust, predictability, and stability. When rules appear to shift, even for justified reasons, central banks respond by expanding options. This can mean diversifying currency exposure, adjusting maturity profiles, or adding new asset classes. These changes are technical and gradual, designed to improve flexibility without disturbing markets. Governments are also watching one another closely. Financial behavior spreads quietly. When one major economy adjusts its reserve strategy, it creates a reference point. When several do so independently, it forms a trend. Policymakers understand that acting too early or too loudly carries risks of its own. Importantly, there is no panic. Markets have not collapsed. Currencies have not unraveled. That stability can be misleading. Deep concern often expresses itself through patience rather than urgency. Institutions built to manage crisis prefer preparation over reaction. The absence of headlines does not signal indifference. It signals caution. The US dollar remains dominant for clear reasons. It is widely accepted, deeply liquid, and supported by the world's largest financial markets. Governments use it to trade, borrow, and store value because they know others will accept it without hesitation. That dominance was not imposed by force. It was built through consistency, reliability, and trust. And force alone cannot sustain a reserve currency. Confidence does. Countries hold dollars not because they are required to, but because doing so has long felt safer than the alternatives. The moment that calculation shifts, even slightly, behavior begins to change. Not through rebellion, but through caution. Fewer new dollar purchases, more experimentation with alternative settlement systems, greater interest in other currencies or neutral stores of value. These moves rarely make headlines, but they accumulate. Reserve managers are trained to avoid concentration risk. Trust itself is a form of concentration. Once questioned, it is reduced. When the belief that dollar assets operate above politics is challenged, the dollar does not collapse overnight. Instead, its unique status begins to blur. It becomes one option among several, rather than the default. Choice. There is a critical difference between collapse and erosion. Collapse is fast and dramatic. Erosion is quiet and persistent. History shows that reserve currencies tend to fade through erosion, not sudden failure. Trade patterns adjust. Infrastructure adapts. Alternatives grow more viable as usage expands. Each step reinforces the next. The concern today is not that the dollar will disappear. It is that its margin of safety narrows. With less unquestioned confidence, the system relies more on incentives and pressure. Volatility increases, flexibility declines, decisions once made automatically now require review, and that alone changes behavior. Recent actions surrounding Russian reserves have exposed a deeper truth about global finance. Money itself has become a weapon. Assets are no longer purely neutral tools for trade or storage. They can be frozen, redirected, or restricted, and the consequences extend far beyond their immediate use. Financial leverage is now central to geopolitical strategy. Countries that control capital flows can influence behavior, shape alliances, and impose costs without firing a single shot. This is modern power, and it is reshaping the global system. One of the most significant outcomes is fragmentation. The world is slowly dividing into financial blocks. Dollar centric economies remain tightly integrated with US systems. Meanwhile, China, Russia, and other emerging powers pursue alternatives to reduce reliance on those networks. These blocks are defined not just by politics, but by currencies, clearing systems, and reserve choices. Neutrality in finance is fading. Banks and central banks that once acted as impartial intermediaries must now navigate a world where financial decisions carry political meaning. Smaller nations face the same challenge. Even those outside great power rivalries must decide where their reserves sit, which systems they rely on, and which partners they trust. Technology accelerates this shift. Digital finance, alternative payment networks, and bilateral settlement systems lower barriers to change. Each innovation reinforces segmentation. Over time, resilience increases for some and vulnerability for others. The result is a world where money is no longer just a medium of exchange. It is strategic leverage, and trust is no longer universal. This is not about Russia alone. It is not even about China alone. It is about a global system where savings are no longer neutral and where financial decisions carry political weight. So here is the question for you. How long can any nation rely on the safety of its wealth when control is held elsewhere? Do you believe the global financial system can adapt and survive this shift? Or are we entering a new era of monetary power struggles? If this analysis raised questions for you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this video insightful, make sure to like it, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more deep analysis on the forces shaping the global economy.